Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. I am Dan, I am a poet and a creative coach, and this channel is all about poetry, writing, and the creative process. I would like to talk to you about how I co-edited the poetry magazine Magma. I have spoken about this magazine before in some of my videos about my favorite poetry magazines, so you can check that out if you wish, here above. You might be interested in this because you are curious to know what being on the other side of a poetry magazine, the editorial side, entails. I was curious about that because I'm always the one sending work to magazines as opposed to being the magazine, and that was a very exciting thing to try out. Or you also might consider editing or co-editing a poetry magazine or an issue of Magma, in which case this could give you a little glimpse into what the process might be like for you. I was invited to co-edit this issue by Paul Stevenson, who I interviewed as well on this channel, so you can check out the interview about his poetry collection here. So he invited me to do this, I believe last September maybe, it must have been nearly a year ago, to work on the summer 2025 issue on ownership. If you know Magma, you might know that each issue usually has different guest editors and a different theme, and so Paul chose the theme, invited me, and also invited Kathy Pimlett to work on co-editing this work. As you can already tell, it was quite a long process. So the first step was to write a call for poems, put it on Magma's website, and do all the social media around it to get as many poems as possible. And that worked very well because we received over 2,300 poems to sift through, and that is why the process takes so long. So once we received all of those poems, we each went through all of the poems. We could have split it into 3 batches, and then each person would go through one batch and then recommend which poems the others should read, or we could have read 2/3 of the submissions, but we decided to read all of them, which is admittedly quite a lot of work. But what's interesting when you do that is that you find that while there are some poems that everybody likes, we also do have very individual preferences on some of the poems, and so that meant more poems were given more consideration. At first we went through the online submissions and just looked at all of the submissions there to already decide to reject some of them. It wasn't as easy as you would think. I expected a lot of poems to maybe not be very high quality, and while it was true of some of them, I would say the vast majority were actually pretty good. And so it wasn't so easy to decide what to keep and what to reject, even at the beginning. We also had cover letters from the poets, and while I had a quick look at each one of them, I didn't pay that much attention to that part. I was mainly focused on the poems. After we discussed things a little bit and we'd all gone through the entire online submissions, we printed out all of the poems that we had selected, or that we hadn't rejected rather, and I used a color coding system to decide which I really want to keep, which I'm less sure of, and to progressively limit the number of poems I would keep. And that is a stage that took so much time. Those first 2 stages were the most time-consuming by far, and it's not so easy to stay focused on every poem when you're doing it for hours, so I really did it over several weeks, only looking at a fairly limited amount each day. At that point, we still hadn't met in person, but we actually ended up all going to the Small Publishers Fair and taking a picture there. So that was the first time all 3 of us met in person during that process, after which we went back to online to discuss the poems we had all agreed upon. Agreeing on these poems is not so easy. You have to decide which compromises you are willing to make and which poems you really want to fight for. It was really interesting to have conversations about that, where sometimes we all agreed that some poems were really good, and at other times we had to convince the others to give a poem a second look because we thought it was special. And that was probably the most interesting part of the process, when you actually get to discuss the poems you like and why you like them, or why you are not so sure of a poem that somebody else likes and need to explain why you are not really into that poem, because we'll get to discuss poetry and that's what it's all about. We also had to contact additional people who were willing to write articles for us on the theme, people whom we thought would have an interesting perspective to give to our issue, and we also had to feature a poet in particular. There were a few things like that the format of the magazine requires. After that, we had a call with the editorial board of Magma, so the people who are permanently part of Magma. They also read all of the poems that we have pre-selected once we've got the gist of it. Maybe we still had 1/3 of poems to get rid of. Get rid of sounds a little heartless, but to eliminate from the process. All the editorial board members gave their opinion on each of the poems we had pre-selected.
It was interesting to read it.
And that also helped us decide to let go of one poem over another one. What they say does not need to be taken into account directly, so we could ignore their opinion, but it's actually quite useful when we've been thinking about some poems for a while to get an external eye and different feedback on the quality of the writing and the poems themselves. In the end, we had to make sure that the poems spoke to the theme of ownership that we had chosen, but also that they took an interesting angle, because you can't have 15 poems that are all trying to do the same thing. And so some poems are about owning a house or other fairly obvious things, but they do it in an original way. And other poems think about the theme of ownership in a very interesting, indirect way, and that adds to the quality of their work, in our opinion, because obviously the purpose is to make an issue out of all of these poems. So if there's too much repetition or too much likeness, we can't really keep poems even when they're good. And sometimes a poem is very good and it just doesn't speak to the theme. So we had to find the right mixture of speaks to theme versus originality versus quality, but we had a lot to choose from. We also had to make sure that form was varied. We all have our own preferences when it comes to the form in poems, but we tried to keep a good variety so that the magazine would also look good and appeal to lots of different readers. After that board, we had another discussion when we were ready to send out emails to the poets who hadn't made it and the poets who were longlisted and then shortlisted for the magazine.
Yeah. So, thank you. You were on the long list, I think we could say that.
Do we say something about, it was about craft, about speaking to the theme was what really...
After that, there was a bit of a break, at least for me, where I didn't have to do much for a while, because once we had sent the poems to the editorial board, there was a graphic designer working on the magazine. There was a lot of proofreading before that as well, so several people proofread and we had to make a few minor corrections. I also made the cover, I made the collage for the cover, so I'm going to make a whole different video to talk about that process, because it was a whole process in and of itself. But at some point, the proofs of the magazines came back. We were able to correct the last issues, get the final proofs, and it was quieter for a while. After that, we had to organize the launch. However, it is Kathy who did almost all of it. She found a venue, she organized everything, and so for me that wasn't a very demanding part of the process, but it was a very exciting part of the process, because suddenly it becomes really real. You've got the proofs of the magazine, you know what it looks like, and you just want to celebrate it and invite as many people over as you can. And so that's what we did. We had the launch at Seven Dials Club in Covent Garden, and we invited all of the poets who were published to come and read their poem at the launch. Obviously, not everyone could make it. We couldn't pay the poets, but we invited all of them, which I think is actually really good, because sometimes editors decide to only select a few poets to read for the launch, and then maybe they read more poems. But we went for one poem per person, and as many people as possible, which made the launch really joyful. And some people, had never read before, others were very used to it, very practiced. But all of the readers were really good, and it gave so much variety. You didn't get bored during those readings, and I thought the atmosphere was really good because everyone was so happy to be included. So here's a picture of the 3 co-editors again, just before the launch started. We also met people from the board of Magma, as well as many readers and other poets who just wanted to take part in the celebration. There was a table with all of the former issues of Magma that could be bought, and several stacks of ours. It feels kind of nice to see something you've been working on for so long in people's hands, to be like, oh, okay, I did this, I don't get to work on a lot of projects these days, and so this was really, really nice for me to do and to see when it came into fruition. That's me looking at the magazine just before the launch. I had received one by post beforehand, so I got to sit down with it and reread it by myself, which was so, so nice. We gave a short address at the beginning. Select the final 60 for the issue, so that was no mean task, but also a very exciting and rewarding process. We were looking for work that was, and we'd like to thank everyone who contributed directly or indirectly to an issue we can be proud of. And next, Paul will tell you a little bit more about all the people who did contribute.
Good evening, everybody. Fantastic to see you all here this evening. And thank you, Kathy, for organising this amazing venue.
And we had plenty of opportunities to talk to the poets who had written articles for us and many of the poets who were featured in the magazines. I really had a great time, and again, it really means something to work for months on a project and then see it coming to life and create a community for one evening where we all felt like we were part of one thing, and being able to facilitate, help facilitate that event was really gratifying. So this was really amazing for me. I enjoyed it so much. I'm really happy that I got to work with Paul and with Kathy, and it was a really good collaboration. I don't know how other collaborations work, but for us it was pretty seamless. I didn't feel any tensions between us, even though we didn't always agree on what we thought about a specific poem. We were all able to listen to other people's opinions and make some compromise on what we wanted individually versus what the others wanted, to end up with a magazine we're all proud of. Thanks to everyone who participated in Magma ownership. I will put the link to the magazine in the description below if you want to get your own copy. It would mean a lot to me because we really want as many people to buy it and see it as possible. I will make another video about making the cover for this magazine. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Like this video if you want more of this. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video very soon. Bye!